on the lectern is hot too, right?
It will be when you end.
Good evening, everyone. If you can take your places, please. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the Ukrainian History Global Initiative. My name is Gillian Tett. I'm Provost of King's College in Cambridge. I'm also with the Financial Times, and I'd like to start by saluting the launch of this project. Many years ago, I did a PhD myself in the former Soviet Union. And one of my supervisors used to say to me, history is not a noun, it's a verb. It's something about events that are constantly moving and changing in the past, but it is constantly contested and changing in the present. And any society that is defining its future needs to have a sense of history that they feel they can respect, that they believe in, and then they feel is credible. For many years, as everyone in the room knows, the history of Ukraine was seen through a filter of imperialism and colonization, of Russification. But now, as Ukraine fights for its land, fights for the present, and fights to define its future, it's also fighting to ensure that the version of history that is presented to itself and the world is one that is accurate, credible, and seen through Ukrainian eyes. So we have an amazing group of people to talk to us tonight about their views on this and their participation in this project. We're going to start with Professor Snyder, a man who needs almost no introduction, at Yale University, who in addition to his books, put out an astonishingly popular, delightfully popular video series last year about the history of Ukraine, which I won't even begin to summarize because I think I'd get a D mark in my grade straight away. But we're going to hear from him. We're also going to hear from Serhii Plokhy, who has written a series of books, and just, in fact, earlier this year, was it this year or last year your last book came out? Wonderful. Many books have come out from Harvard. You can correct me too. Again, I will not pass any history exam myself. And then we're going to hear from Professor Yaroslav Rytzak from Ukrainian Catholic University, who's also highly respected, highly esteemed, and a prolific writer. So we have three of the most esteemed experts on Ukrainian history. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Viktor Pinchuk, the man who's made all of this possible by launching this initiative, who can explain to us why he has launched this initiative. After that, we'll have a chance to have some questions from the audience, and that will be followed by a panel debate. But I'd like to start with Professor Snyder to tell us why you think this project is so important today. And being professorial, Professor Snyder is going to speak from the lectern. I've learned in my fairly brief experience in Cambridge so far that I don't get between an academic and their lectern.
Well, thank you very much, Gillian, and thank you for the warm spirit. Okay. The warm spirit of the introduction. It's a special pleasure to be able to have good news. This is an evening which is about good news. I think it's very good news indeed that Ukrainians and others are in a position to launch something, to begin something, to demonstrate that they have the emotional, intellectual, social resources to carry out something on a grand scale. The Ukrainian History Global Initiative is not just a piece of discourse or a mood or an evening. It's a project. It's a structure. It's an institution. It's an attempt made by well over 100 people organized in about 70 topics over about 3 years to try to fundamentally redo, or indeed do, the history of a people. What's innovative about it is that this is meant to be deep history, history from the very beginning, history before we have written sources, history which brings in the paleontologists and the archaeologists and even the biologists and the zoologists. All of this was Victor's idea. It's meant to be broad history. It's not history of Ukraine where we're looking to prove that the present had to be brought about by the past. It's a history in which we look at every possible theme and every possible moment of contact between the lands and peoples of what's now Ukraine and everyone around them, all of the trends, all of the social trends, all of the political trends. It's meant to be a kind of national history, but a national history that's open, that asks the questions, who are we, not knowing the answer ahead of time, which asks the question, how did this nation come about, without knowing the answer ahead of time. Its principles are that we will have scholars who are working in complete independence, who will be supported over a period of 3 years. These scholars will be invited to collaborate in 3 major conferences in Ukraine and in any number of workshops that they care to organize, which will also be supported. This project will be multidisciplinary. Most of us are historians, but there are also, as I say, people representing other disciplines. It will be international. Most of the participants are Ukrainian, but essentially beyond Ukraine, the entire world is represented. I'm very pleased also, personally, that we can launch this in a museum, and in particular in the British Museum, where I wrote much of my dissertation. There used to be a library where the Grand Hall is now, as some of you will remember, and I used to sit there and take notes and write my chapters. But I'm pleased about it too, because it allows us to think about where this project could take us. A museum is a collection of familiar stories. In this museum, there's the familiar story of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the classical ancient civilizations. But what if it were the case that at the same time as those civilizations were active, there was a pastoral people north of the Black Sea that introduced Indo-European languages, including the one that I'm now speaking, right? It goes back to these people. What if it were the case that there were a civilization which didn't leave behind a historical trace, but which spread pretty much all of the languages which we now use? And what if we now knew that on the basis of ancient DNA evidence as well as archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence? That place that I'm talking about is now Ukraine. In this museum, you have the history of ancient Greece. There's the legend of Achilles confronting Amazons. But what if it really were the case that ancient Greeks fought female warriors on horseback? And what if it really were the case that these female warriors were Scythians? What if we now know on the basis of archaeology that Greeks and female warriors did in fact engage in combat? More than that, what if we also knew that ancient Greece at its height, the period of Aristotle, the period of Plato, Socrates, was dependent upon the Ukrainian steppe for its food? What if we knew that that was one big culture, one big plural culture, and not just something centered in Athens? One goes on with the major themes as they're represented now in places like this, and one realizes that wherever one looks, one adds Ukraine or the lands and peoples of Ukraine, and the entire picture shifts. These are early Roman statues. But what if Rome didn't fall? The ones I'm looking at them, you're not. You don't have to all turn around. It's a theatrical gesture. Pretend there are statues back there. There actually are, for those watching on TV. What if Rome didn't fall? What if Rome continued as Byzantium? What if the first state on the territory of Ukraine, Kiev, and Rus is part of Byzantine history? What if there weren't really ever dark ages? What if in Kiev you have the meeting of a continuous Roman civilization with a new, vital, enlivening Viking age? What if not just Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, not to mention England and Normandy and Sicily, were Viking states? But what if Kiev and Rus was? Because it was, right? Every time you look at some portion of European history, and I'm focusing on the earlier periods, and you add Ukraine, it shifts. The landscape of the museum has to shift. The whole modern history of colonialism and empire looks very different when you realize that Ukraine was a colony of both Poland and Russia. The whole history of the Second World War looks different if you understand that Germany's main war aim was the conquest of Ukraine. And I would venture to say that the history of the 21st century looks different if you understand the reasons why Ukraine resisted the Russian invasion. So this is not a project about the war, and it's not a reaction to the war, but it does tend to answer the question, where did these people come from? Right? This surprising behavior, it can't just be a matter of February 24th, 2022. It must have deeper roots. So the way we're going to pursue this is just as scholarly as it can possibly be done, but with the goal of making our findings, which because they're scholarly cannot be predicted entirely, with the goal of making our findings in 3 years' time accessible to all and as many forums as we can think of. And this is my last note. Also with the goal of setting an example. We're in a world with too little history and too much myth. We're in a world in which history is too often dismissed, and we're asked to think only about the future. You can't think about the future without the past. So we mean this as a project which is valuable in its own right, but which might also serve as a model for how other nations, other peoples, other groups might think about the relationship between the past and the future. So as I say, I don't often get to do this. I'm very glad to be able to stand up before you and have nothing but good news, and I'm very able to do it in the company of my colleagues, both Serhii and Yaroslav Rycak, from whom I've learned many of the things I've just said, and also very happy to do it in the company of Viktor Pinchuk, whose idea this whole thing was. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Snyder. And I'll just say, I'm not a historian. I'm not a professor of Ukrainian history or expert on Ukraine at all. But many years ago, when I was in Moscow doing my own PhD, I was told by a Russian teacher that Ukraine meant on the edge, borderlands, and very much presented as a kind of dismissive derivative of Russian culture. It was kind of an afterthought on the edge. And in essence, what you're saying is it's time to view Ukraine as being in the center and the central hub around so much happened, not but basically in the center. And that's a very different perspective on history, which I think will be fascinating for anyone who's looking across the entire Eurasian area to reimagine the world and look at it through new eyes. Professor Blochi, you have come over from Harvard. You've both flown across the Atlantic, especially for this event. Tell us your thoughts about this project, and you can either go to the lectern if you like, or you can speak from the chair.
I guess I'll go over there. I liked the way
okay, this is
how Tim Snyder's what was received. So
this is competitive lecturning. So.
It's tough act to follow, but I will try my best. So, well, thank you. This is exactly what I was going to talk about and want to talk about. This journey from the edge to the center, because this initiative, this project, is extremely important part of the journey that started in terms of modern Ukrainian history a long time ago, certainly 100 years ago and earlier than that. My position at Harvard, position in Ukrainian history, is named after Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the first head of Ukrainian independent state in 1918, and the historian who is credited with establishing Ukrainian history as a separate subject, which the idea was quite controversial at the time. He couldn't get position of that sort in the Russian Empire. He was invited to the neighboring Austria-Hungary, to the city of Lviv, where he was given a position in world history with emphasis on Eastern Europe. So that's where it all started in late 19th century. And once Hrushevsky produced his 10-volume history of Ukraine, just put in one volume after another and saying, okay, there is this place, there is this history. The Soviet Union and the Soviet historiography, historical establishment, they accepted the idea that there is Ukrainian history. But what you saw after that was the attempt really to put it into the big box that would be called either Soviet history or, more specifically, Russian history. So the historians who were practicing Ukrainian history were chased into immigration. The historians who stayed in the 1920s and 1930s, most of them were sent to Gulag. So that's the road from the edge, from the periphery, the road for recognition of a discipline of history. The recognition of the narrative, in Hrushevsky's case, national narrative, was also a very important prerequisite of recognition of legitimacy of Ukraine as a country, legitimacy as a nation. And this project is very much about research, about international research, about collaboration, and it is about the international recognition. It is about recognition not as a periphery on the margins of either Soviet or Russian historiography, but about this movement to the center. For me personally, this is a very, very exciting project because it provides with the opportunity to work with others. We historians are in very many ways in still a pre-manufacture age where we are doing all ourselves. We look for the sources, we interpret them, we try then to write big histories. And what we lack are really platforms for collaboration. Collaboration between each other, between people coming from different disciplines in history, but also different disciplines beyond humanities as well. The most exciting developments that are happening today in history are about combination, finding new materials about DNA, bringing together issues related to climate and also history as well. So that's where the frontier, the next frontier, or already the existing frontier, is there. And without platforms like that, without initiatives like that, we would really stay in the age of the 12th century chronicle writers. I respect them very much. They were great people, but I think it's time to move on, and this particular project is the way how it is happening. It will answer to a number of big questions related, as already was stated here, not just to Ukrainian history, but to the history of the region and world history in general. The latest wave in the Russian, Eurasian, East European studies, and that will be the topic of the convention in Philadelphia, Association for Slavic East European Studies, is decolonization. But what decolonization means, whether you just take a term from French and British history and bring it somehow to Eastern Europe, we don't know yet. I'm not just hopeful, I'm sure that this project will provide one of the very, very important answers to this big question. For me, it's a project about bringing Ukrainian history to the world, and it's also the project about bringing world history and world experience to Ukraine and to Ukrainian history. And in many ways, in terms of the effort, in terms of resources, in terms of people involved, I know some of them, I'm really super, super optimistic about the future of this project, and I hope that I was able to actually pass a little bit of that enthusiasm to you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Blochy. And I think that the theme of Ukraine being in the center and not on the edge is a very powerful one indeed. We're now going to hear from Professor Hrytsak, who's come to us from Lviv, I believe, and is a professor, as I said earlier, the Ukrainian Catholic University and in Lviv. You can speak at the lectern if you would like, or at the chair.
I would prefer sitting because this makes me a lesser target, so to say, for attacks. I would like to put this project in the context of nowadays academical writings and discussion both in Ukraine and globally. And I will start with the famous saying by Oscar Wilde. He wrote once that there is only one thing that we owe to history, and it's rewriting it. And I believe Ukrainian historians were extremely good in their writing of history. They did not because of curiosity or comfort, because of necessity. The name of Hrushevsky was mentioned. He was the biggest Ukrainian historian. Unfortunately, he was not the best Ukrainian politicians, because later when he became a head of Ukrainian national state, it failed to Bolsheviks. And there started discussion why this was the reason for the failure, and they discovered there's probably something wrong with the historical scheme of Hrushevsky. There's probably something wrong with the way he wrote the history. And basically, this is a very good question. Because extremely after the war, starting with the interwar period, but extremely after the war, once the younger generation of people who survived the war and moved to North America and made a career in Harvard, Columbia, Toronto, they started this project they call Rethinking Ukrainian History. This is Igor Shevchenko, Milan Pritsak, Ivan Lysakroditsky. And I would say the project was largely a success, because they rethought what Ukrainian identity is, or what kind Ukraine has identity have to be successful, so to say. And the answer was relatively simple, that Ukraine has denied both Soviet and nationalist legacy, and start thinking about Ukraine identity in civic terms, not ethnic terms, like Hrushevsky was thinking. And basically, without this rethinking, you could hardly imagine a situation that Serhiy described in his book, this kind of Ukrainian phenomenon. They have a Ukrainian president who is of Jewish origin and Minister of Defense who is the Crim-Tatarian origin, which means this is kind of very much civic identity. And I would say they did it projectly very successfully. Without this project of rewriting, rethinking Ukrainian identity, you could hardly have this kind of success with the have in 1991. Because basically there was a lot of kind of the suspicion theories, or the kind of thing that Ukraine is not sustainable, that it will fail as a state, it will be divided to kind of theories of two Ukraines. The imminent CIA came with a prognosis in 1993. I have to be reminded, CIA came with a prognosis in 1993 that Ukraine is heading to civil war between Ukrainian-speaking West and Russian-speaking East, in comparison with which, quoting verbatim, Yugoslav war will look like an innocent picnic. And this is what was the profiler, because basically the way they imagined, they reconsidered this identity, that Ukrainian identity difference from Russian identity is not about language, it's not about religion, because basically we are similar in very sense. The main difference is about political traditions. The Ukrainian society is organized very differently, so to say. To put it briefly or rudely, that you could hardly imagine Putin in Ukraine and, unfortunately, victorious Maidan in Russia. So this proves you the idea, this kind of the differences. What I'm saying here, they did a very good job of rethinking, but this was very good for 1991. It's not good enough for 2022, once Ukraine started to face the war, because agendas becoming much more complicated, much more challengeable. I now have no doubt that Ukrainian nation would exist and Putin could not erase it, all kind of things. But the main question, which already started before the war, is why we have two Maidans. How to make Ukraine successful? Because there's a big discrepancy. We're talking about natural resources, and resources defines a lot, geography. Ukraine is very rich in resources. But there is a paradox there. You have a rich country of poor people. And this kind of discrepancy that led people to the street to protest, to choose Poroshenko, then Zelensky, all the kind of things. So what I'm saying here, agenda is becoming much more complicated, much more challengeable. And I remember some 20 years ago when I listened to the lecture of Professor Timothy Gerton Ash, he said that once you have a very complicated issue, the best way to solve it is try to extend the context. And I would say, given the global issue, global character of Ukrainian problem, the best possible context is a global context. You have to go both deep, starting probably for the beginning from dinosaurs, all kind of thing, but also have very global context. So this is exactly, I believe, the story which we very much need. In a sense, I believe it also corresponds to some extent, to the needs of nowadays war. To a large extent, this is war about the past, because most arguments of Putin is of historical character. He used the history to legitimize his aggression against Ukraine. I'm not going to say that we have to respond with this problem. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to respond to, because if Putin would not commit any other crimes, he would be punished just for the way he abuses the history. But this is a crime. This is a crime. So basically what I'm saying here, I believe that this is the way this kind of strategy difference between Ukraine and Russia goes deeper in terms of it deals with the history. Because basically, strategy of Putin is return to the past, because he wants to get Russia superpower again, has been in Soviet time, Russian Empire, all the kind of things. And I would say this is very much troubling and concerning us, because it's not just Putin. I believe it's a kind of the general strategy for all the populists come to power, because they use this kind. We have to return to history. Let's make America great again. All the kind of things that we know, so to say, because they presume there's some kind of golden age. When we once golden age, we have to return to. Luckily enough, and this is our legal luck, Ukraine has no golden age. It has nowhere to return. It's exactly, I believe, Ukrainian strategy is radically different, because we try to overcome the past. And I believe to a large extent, it also coincides with this kind of new trend, name it as it is, tendency that emerges recently, very much optimistic trend in the historical writing, which could be roughly could be defined as applied history. History that makes sense, and history to help you understand what's going on, and also trace some kind of possible scenarios of the future. Probably you know this is one of the most famous texts. This has come from the Harvard University when he is teaching the Historical Manifesto by David Armitage, now the Belfer Center Applied History. Basically, they said that we need a new kind of history, a history which is very much global and very much deep, the history that could help us to use resources of the past to make sense of the present and to trace the scenarios of the future. So why I'm so excited about this project? Because I believe it's a project exactly that meets this expectation and goes both deep and the space. And I'm just speechless. I have nothing to add, so to say, because I'm so exciting. I'm looking very much forward to this project, because I believe this is a project that is very much needed for Ukraine, but I also would say it's very much needed for the world.
Right.
Because the advantage of the global history, that once you focus on Ukrainian history, it makes like a mirror, a little like a looking glass, but you see yourself. Any kind of the society, any kind of the country, by looking in Ukraine, right, exactly could and define yourself. So therefore, I have nothing to say, but just to give my gratitude and what I know the words for the Victor, Timothy, and Sergei for initiating this project. Thank you so much.
Well, as we heard earlier, it is very unusual. It's very unusual to get 3 historians to collaborate. To try and get 70 historians to collaborate on a joint project and bring in other disciplines as well is probably almost unprecedented. So I'd like to ask you, Victor, why? Why are you doing this now?
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Yes, I'm Ukrainian businessman, and my background, I'm not historian, I'm metallurgical engineer, and maybe, you will ask me why. I feel that my generation and particularly Ukrainian business, we have a great, unique chance and privilege. We can participate in the creation and building of new country. I understood this from 1991, 92. But for that, this understanding came to me a little bit later. For that, we have to answer to the very fundamental question, who are we? And I will tell you a little bit about development, how I came to this idea. 20 years ago, I founded the NGO Yalta European Strategy. Yes, you participated several times in our conferences. Main idea was and is promotion European membership in Ukraine. In 2004, it was a very new idea. And initially, we invited the best politicians from all the world to learn about Ukraine and to talk with Ukrainians and to inspire Ukrainians. With the time, I understood that politicians is great, very important, but their knowledge not enough deep for us, and we have to start to talk also with the economists, because world leading economists who will explain for Ukrainians what kind of reforms we have to implement. it took also for me a few years to understand that even their knowledge and understanding not enough fundamental. We have to dig even deeper. And I came to the idea and understanding that we have to start to talk with historians and psychologists. And because they are working on the most fundamental, deepest level. And we started to invite really great historians like Timothy Snyder and Yuval Harari, Neil Ferguson, and later Sergei Plokhy also started to visit us, and Anne Applebaum. And they inspired me. I started to think about this more and more. But the way I also was inspired for many years by the book of second president of Ukraine. Ukraine is not Russia, because it's was very important book, and was written when he was in the office in 2003. Yes, and but trigger was when I read the book of Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I was really amazed. For me, it was incredible new understanding, because for me as engineer, his logic, very strong logic, his explanation how fundamentally important geography for the shaping of the countries, societies, nations, for me it was absolutely new, and it was so strong and so logical. I said, wow, what if somebody can use this, for me, new approach, methodology for explaining much deeper and fundamentally Ukrainian history? Why not to invite maybe somebody from Jared Diamond's school? Because for me, it was like, I will give you an analogy. When we're talking about development of individuals, we're talking what's more important. This is never-ending discussion. What's more important, genes in our blood or environment, culture? And the same, my understanding was that what he said, geography, as a geography, climate, natural resources, rivers, mountains. In Ukrainian case, fundamentally important factor, black soil. What's more important, this geography or people, events? And I understood we have to make really fundamental research with disciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. And I started to think who will be the best partner to talk, whom to talk with. And many people told me, Timothy Snyder. And it happened that something like 3.5 years ago, and I want to read this, 3.5 years ago, this is not response to somebody, to somebody who wrote this fake essay about history of and about brotherhood, etc., etc. 3.5 years ago, we started to talk with Professor Snyder about this idea about multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, collective approach to Ukrainian, fundamental Ukrainian history. It was very important from the very beginning for us that we have to invite the best people from different schools. It has to be absolutely independent, scientific research. And okay, more or less this is how it happened, how it started, let's say, this idea. Okay, it took for us more than 3 years just to came to the British Museum. We are here.
Well, that's
Thank
wonderful.
You.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, I have lots of questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask any questions they'd like to about the project, about where they think history is going, the future of history in Ukraine and its significance. My one question is, if you can, or my one request is, please, if you can introduce yourself as a courtesy, and please keep your question short rather than a long statement. So, would anyone like to ask any questions about the project? We have a question back there.
Nina Kuriata, Tortoise Media. I just wanted to ask you that, of course, you said that this project is not about the war, but we can't avoid talking about the war while Ukraine, which is the object of your investigation, is now fighting for its very existence. So how can this project help to the world to understand that it's important, and in the 3 years when this project ends, Ukraine will be in the better position than now? What would you say to all that people who say, well, yeah, Ukrainian history is very important, but what about my energy bills? Thank you.
Professor Snyder.
So I'm going to give you a couple of answers. One is that there's a question which is of obvious importance, which colleagues have already raised in different ways, which is, why did February 2022 go the way that it did? Why was the Kremlin and, maybe this is too American English, the Beltway, why were Washington and Moscow equally wrong? And they were equally wrong. They said the same things. I heard them with my own ears. Why were we equally wrong? What led us to misunderstand Ukrainian society? And how might those errors be more general errors about the way the world actually works? Because if we could get something of this importance wrong, maybe we misunderstand a lot of other things. Relatedly, why is the war that's going on, in effect, a world war? Why is it that so many people around the world have so many different kinds of stakes in this war? Why is it that when Americans talk about this war, they can't do so without talking about China? And I think this sort of project can help us to understand that this is actually typical of Ukrainian history, that in general, every part of what seems to be European or global history doesn't really make sense until you put Ukraine into it. But my most fundamental response to this is that, and this is now a historian's response, is that the long-term projects and institutions often are the things that turn out to be of decisive importance. You know, it's very easy to get excited about what's happening today or yesterday or next week, or to ask what's going to happen tomorrow. But in the history of the development of societies, it's very often the initiatives which last, which end up making the difference. And so we're trying to do something which is going to endure, in the sense of lasting for 3 years, but also in the sense of laying the foundations for something which could last for even longer than that. So the war is taking place on one time scale, and we can't, it's important to take place on a different time scale too, and not just to follow what's happening day to day in the war.
Do any of you want to add? Because we have some questions from the audience. Any other comments? Okay, we'll go on. Okay, we have a question over there. So go there, and then over there. So.
Ursula Woolley, I'm the chair of the Ukrainian Institute in London, and I'm very proud that I've just defended my PhD looking at how different practices and approaches in Ukraine help it to combat Russian history propaganda. This is not a question for academics, but it's a question that's waiting to be asked, so I will ask it anyway. It possibly is a question for Viktor Mikhailovich, who I know is very good at getting things done. Can you tell us a bit more about how this project is going to roll out, how it's going to happen? Can you tell us a bit more about how this project is going to happen?
So that is the practicalities. How do you herd 80 historians or academics together?
Okay, that is so easy because academics. No, it's so easy because academics also need good news. I mean, following on what Slavko said or what Serhii said, we need opportunities to cooperate. It's really important, and the kind of project that we're talking about can't be done alone. You can't do it alone. It demands cooperation. And so we're going to have cooperation which is multi-generational, which is multinational, which is multidisciplinary. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy about this. How do we herd people together? Look at what we have, right? I mean, Harvard and Yale, right? Here we are, right? Look how easy that was. And if we can overcome that, but
No problem.
yeah, but in all seriousness, I mean, the fact that we have this new generation, there are two new young generations of Ukrainian historians now, some of whom we're about to hear from. We have internationally now recognized historians of Ukraine. What Serhiy Plokhy has done with the Hrushevsky Chair at Harvard is unbelievable, right? So we have this opportunity to work together. It's not actually hard. Practically speaking, we have fellowship support for about 90 historians and other scholars over 3 years. We're going to host 3 very large conferences, hopefully all 3 in Ukraine, and we'll have as many workshops as the participants care to organize in order to collaborate with people doing similar fields. And at the end of this, we'll have bountiful, publicly accessible pieces of writing. That's how it's going to work. But also because it's history, it has the wonderful aspect of being unpredictable, right? One of the reasons why I want to cooperate with my colleagues is that I know that when we do, we will come up with things which we can't anticipate. So this is also meant to be something that we are going to enjoy.
That sounds like the recipe for some great parties. But anyway, we've got a question there, and then over there.
Hi, I'm Paul Mason. I'm a British journalist who has been raising solidarity with Ukraine here in our British Labour movement, which is sometimes hard to do. The question I have is, teleology is unfashionable, but it can be quite useful. Many of the institutions you work in are formed around a question. Why did country X exist? What is its future? What is its past? I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of, in the discussions you've had to form this project, what are the debates that you expect there to be? Gillian, we know in Britain, we have debates about, did the City of London retard British capitalism or advance it? What are the emergent debates in the new Ukrainian historiography?
Would anyone venture their thoughts about what are the critical issues that will have to be illuminated?
This is just a guess. But I believe the most discussed issue with just the heaviest political bearings is the Second World War. And it's very hard to find consensus in Ukraine, and I'm afraid it'll be hard to find a consensus among the scholars, but I believe something has to be written on this line, probably fixing the different attitudes to say. Because still, this is very much, Ukraine has been divided, and this is actually one of the most dividing issues in Ukrainian historical memory. I'm not saying we're talking with the historical memory, so that's probably the other issue that's been mentioned already by Timothy, decolonization. Because there is even no consensus about this issue among Ukrainian historians. To what extent Ukraine was a colony, to what extent it was not a colony, so to say. Does colonization really make a sense? To what extent did it make a sense? 2 days ago, there has been an article by Yulia Latinina, one of the most prolific Russian publicists, very much anti-Putin, and she says that probably this what Ukraine tries to do with decolonization placed in the hands of the Putin, so to say. So this is what I'm saying here. Again, this is issue which is going to relate to the nowadays current situation. But I would put differently, there is a hardly topic nowadays in Ukrainian history could find a consensus, which is good.
Okay. Of course, one of the great strengths of Ukraine today is the fact there is such lively, strong sense of independent agency, and people do not want to fall in line easily, and that's of course one of the strengths. Serhiy, do you have any comments about what you think are going to be the key issues, or some of the key issues that will be for discussion, whether it's the history of Crimea, whether it's a question of self-government in Ukraine, or...
One of the biggest issues, it seems to me, that Ukrainian history and Ukrainian historians face is thinking about Ukraine both as a place and country and culture, in relationship with multiple empires, right? Ukrainian history is either blessed or cursed by the fact that it wasn't just one empire. And looking at the way how the cultural, institutional, and other impacts of different empires work on the same place and on the same group of people, and providing also insights in the history of all those other multi-ethnic, multi-national, multi-religious empires. This is extremely important, and in that sense, with the debates getting outside of the box of the debates about Ukrainian history alone, but getting into the broader discussions and broader debates about all those places. And there was a question, of course, about the current war. Well, one of the issues that certainly historians have to contribute to is the big question about the origins of this war. And it's the immediate task that certainly everyone expects historians to contribute in one way or another. And we have already different perspectives among historians and political scientists and others. One way or another, we will be either directly or indirectly addressing that set of issues and questions as well. But as Tim just said, we certainly are very happy to expect unexpectable, and clearly there will be sparks in relations between us on different levels, sparks that will produce the fire of the discussion and the energy for new discoveries. So again, that's just a number of issues that are being discussed and debated. And we didn't mention here the traditional suspects, the usual suspects, issues related to the Second World War, issues related to Holodomor and Ukrainian famine. We'll be addressing those as well. But the beauty of this project and the beauty of cooperation is that there will be new questions and new discussions and new discoveries.
Right, we have a question over there.
I'm David Knowles, I'm from The Telegraph. I cover Ukraine there pretty much every day for the past 2 years. I don't know if this is an easy or a difficult question for the historians, but if the British Museum turned around and said, we're opening a new Ukraine wing with all the resources and the money in the world, what object or artifact or exhibit would you most want to see in that wing, and why?
That sounds like you're being given your homework to the professors. Professor Snyder, and you can't start off by saying you want it to be in Yale instead.
So I appreciate that question, and I was trying to, in a way, start that line of thought with my own presentation, that the objects that one sees here or in any museum follow the logics that seem natural to us. One could take the objects that are here and tell completely different stories. Sometimes it's not a matter of not having the objects, it's a matter of not having the imagination. So one can write the whole Western civilization story quite differently, where you note from the beginning that the Greeks were in this relationship with Scythia, where you note from the beginning that Rome never fell, that you realize that there is a Viking Age pattern of states in Northern and Eastern Europe which get left out of the Franco-German English way of thinking about the world. One can note that empire also took place, as Serhii was just stressing, in Europe. One could do that with the objects that are in this museum to a large extent. But I want to also make another point riffing from your question, which has to do with the tyranny over historians and the tyranny of history. The tyranny over historians is something which colleagues have alluded to. If you can take historians and send them to the Gulag, this is a dramatic example of how we don't know things that we should know. So some of the things that are missing in Ukrainian history are not the artifacts, but the people who were quite literally killed or imprisoned. And because we didn't have those people for the last 100 years, the history is less clear to us than it might have been. But a second related point is, and this goes to kind of the limits of your question, the tyranny of history itself. So history depends upon written records. And in the second instance, we'll look at things that are made out of stone. But a lot of what actually happened in the past wasn't written down. And as Sergei already signaled, the most exciting things about the deep past are now coming out of new kinds of carbon dating, ancient DNA, and things that allow us to get around the lack of written sources and which have really changed the picture of the ancient past, such that, very happily for our project, our part of the world now looks to be much more central than it used to be. So one thing you would want to do if you're doing this properly would be have a room in your museum which is empty of artifacts and which explains explains this sort of tyranny of history. So when I think of the tyranny, so I'm a historian, so tyranny of history is very paradoxical for me. Usually I think of history as being liberating, but what we're trying to do is to bring in the archaeologists and the paleontologists and others so that we can do the things that historians alone can't do, and then in that way get a much bigger, richer past. Okay, I bought you guys some time.
And while you're thinking, I'll say if I had to choose one image for this, I'd say it should be a wheel. And instead of going back to Sergei's point, instead of seeing Ukraine as being the rim, putting it in the center as a hub from which the spokes flow in so many areas. But Professor Blochi and then Professor Rydzak.
What I really want, if I had the resources and power, I would really love to have a hall in this museum, which, of course, surprise, surprise, would be dedicated to Ukrainian history. But the question is, what history? The history that will bring together the civilizational and cultural trends and ideas and objects that don't meet anywhere else in the world, but they meet in Ukraine, making the place unique, and telling through these artifacts not just the history of Ukraine, but history of a good part of the world, from the Roman Empire, when you look at the Crimea and southern Ukraine, which was part of that, from Greek colonies in the Crimea to the Viking Age and other things. So I would like to have the room that would really, through the objects, realize the potential of the project that we are starting today.
If I have money, unfortunately, I would never have. Make a museum like a British museum. Make museum like British Museum in Kyiv, because this is exactly where this kind of museum is badly really needed, and I know there's a lot of discussion before the war and increasingly after the war that some say that has to be done. Secondly, I believe that there's a chance that on the base of our project, we could come with some exhibition about the contribution So one of the facts that has been recently discussed, that most likely domestication of the horse happened exactly in Ukrainian part of the European steppe, because the grass was greener there, so to say. And I was guessed that the first history of Ukraine is not written by Hrushevsky, it's written by Herodotus, because it has a chapter on Skisi, all the kind of things. So I would like to say there has been discussion, stupid discussion, I'm sorry to refer it, but there is discussion why there is no African Dostoevsky. And the answer was Dostoevsky translated in any African language is African Dostoevsky. So what I mean to say here, that any object that is in British Museum which is related to Ukrainian history is a part of Ukrainian history that has to be shown, so say. I don't know where the statue comes from, but chances they must be from Crimea, from some other part. So this is basically what I say. So I hope that probably on the base of this project, we could make such exhibition that will show how much this Ukrainian and global history is entangled and what comes after it.
Well, it will certainly make a fantastic BBC series, I can see.
Few words for
Yes, please.
engineer, not for
Yes. I'm sure we'll have plenty of engineering implements from history, but yes.
No, Julian, I really think that what I would present here, small box, transport box with Ukrainian black soil, because I think this is absolutely in the core of Ukrainian history, and this is one of the most fertile, if not the most fertile soil on the planet, and this is in the core of Ukrainian history of even 20th century and 21st century. You know, for Hitler, the main idea to move towards Soviet Union was the idea that Ukraine has to become his breadbasket for his empire, for example. And now we know what happening with Ukrainian agriculture products. And I think this is one of the most important.
Right.
Ukrainian artifact.
In just a moment, we're going to hear from 3 of the up-and-coming Ukrainian scholars, the next generation, if you like. Excuse me, but we have a question over there on this side before we do.
Hi.
Sorry. Okay, you and then the lady there. Why don't we hear both questions, one after the other?
Hi, Tom Watling, The Independent. Taking the idea that history is a verb, not a noun, to what extent does the history of Donbass, the history of Crimea, have to be treated not separately, but sort of concurrently with a wider history of Ukraine?
Great question, and a question over here.
Charlotte Higgins from The Guardian. Since you were talking about archaeology, prehistory and material history, I wanted to raise the kind of subject of the material depredations that are occurring in Ukraine at the moment, in the sense of archaeological sites being hugely damaged, cultural heritage being damaged, museum collections, archives being expropriated, let's put it that way. Surely this has a huge effect on your the sort of possibilities of what can be done, but there's also an absolutely huge issue in terms of Ukraine's history and identity.
Right, 2 questions, and I think we'll have to wrap it after that and bring on the other 3 historians. But
very simple answer is that, of course, they're part of Ukrainian history, and they have to be treated as such. And the history of Ukrainian, thank you. And the history of industrialization in Ukraine, which is essential part of history of Ukraine in the 20th century, is not just incomplete without Donbass. You can't write it without Donbass. You can't also fully understand this current war if you don't think also about the fate of the rust belts and what happens with the first generation of industrialization areas, Europe, in the world in general. So you're really not including Donbass or any other region of Ukraine. You lose a big part, not just Ukrainian history, but also global history. And that's the only way how to write it, because if you, for whatever reason, decided that this or that political border should define the way how you look at history, the borders have been changing in Ukraine for centuries. In the 20th century in particular, they were going back and forth. This is the approach, if one chooses it, leads to nowhere, and leads to not just truncated Ukraine, it leads to truncated history. And I could go on almost every region in Ukraine that really contributes to our understanding of history of Ukraine as a whole. Thank you.
Do you want to address the question of, yes, Timothy?
Slightly slightly different take, and then on to Charlotte's question. There's in this this tension between ethnic and political history that Jaroslav Rethinking mentioned is a way to address this business about Donbass and Crimea. So Donbass is actually not at all the ethnic frontier of Ukraine, the Ukrainian language frontier of Ukraine. The Ukrainian language was spoken far to the east of Donbass, and the historical notion of Ukraine actually was far to the east of the present eastern border of Ukraine. So if one is doing the history of, like, we're doing much more, but if you were doing the history of Ukrainian-speaking people, you'd have to go far east of the current Ukrainian-Russian boundary. And then the other point is about political history, which I have from Serhii Plokhy's very fine book, Gates of Europe, that if you want to understand the politics of the Ukrainian state and society, you have to go north-south. You have to answer the question of how this thing in Kiev goes south through the steppe and how it gets as far as Crimea, which is a matter of political history. And of course, with Crimea, now adding to what Serhii said, you have to have Crimea because you have to have the history of the Crimean Tatars, you have to have the history of the Crimean Khanate, which is 400 years of history, much longer than anybody else's claim to the place, of course, is the Crimean claim to the place, but also because the Crimean Tatars get you into the history of the Cossacks and the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which are two absolutely indispensable institutions. And when I put it that way, it helps, I think, answer some of the earlier questions of how we're working together. We're going to have people working on Crimea and on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and on the Cossacks, and we're going to make sure that they're working together and collaborating so that these themes make sense. On Charlotte's question, we have, where'd you go? We have the ambition to organize and fund digs. We want to actually support active archaeology as well as summarizing existing archaeological finds. We're going to try to organize new digs that are going to go on during these 3 years. And then, of course, I'm glad you mentioned depredations, because I gave a long, clever answer to your question, but, you know, the Scythian gold, which was taken during the Soviet Union and spread all over museums in the Soviet Union, and which has now been taken by the Russian Federation. There's just such a strong claim. The nation's a very modern thing, but there's a very strong claim to be able to associate something that comes out of the ground with the place it came out of the ground. And the Scythian gold, so much of it came out of what's now Ukraine, and that goes back to the question of you know, what the object would be. So thanks.
Professor Rethinking.
There is one thing that we tend to forget, and this was the contribution of Donbass miners in Ukrainian independence, which was crucial in the summer 1981. Without them, they're probably independent, but of different ways, so to say. But this is something. The first decommunization in Ukraine occurred in Donbass, in Donetsk, which is very hard to fathom, so to say. Talking about Crimea, I know the Victor is collector of wines, very important thing, but Crimea connects Ukrainian territory to Mediterranean world. Because given the fact that Ukraine has vineyards and produces brandy, Ukraine is one of the few countries in the world that produce brandy. There are not that many countries, which gives you the idea that it's related to this world. And actually, if you look at the spread of the Christianity, which is the use wine as a kind of the wine and bread or the kind of thing, you quite have a quite a different perspective, so to say. It's very hard to imagine history of Ukraine, history of Kiev without Crimea, so to say, because yes, exactly, the Norman was going south, but the culture, the civilization come from this Mediterranean region, so to say. So this is something important. I mean, it's coming very naturally once you start thinking about that. And this is very important to put the right question, and then we have this kind of results.
Right, thank you. It's been a fantastic discussion. We are going to go now into the second part of the evening and hear from some of the young, or young-ish, and they look young to me, but they're not, up-and-coming new generation and the future of historical studies in Ukraine. I was going to ask whether Victor wanted to say something, but clearly not. Why don't you come up to the stage, because I want to hear from you. We have here Yes, you're staying, yes. Fantastic, exactly. Yes. So we have three fantastic scholars here. We have at the very end Daria Mattingly, who's a lecturer of European history at the University of Chichester. We've got Yulia Yurchenko, who's senior lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich, and Olga Ganid, Building Your Careers Now. It's fantastic to have you from your perspective. And what do you think the most urgent issues are to be discussed? Maybe I can start with you, Daria.
Julia.
Sorry, Yulia. Sorry.
No, never mind. It's fine. Thank you so much for having me as part of this project. Thank you so much for making it a reality. It's really fantastic to be a part of this. It's been a while since I've been called up and young and up and coming. It's going to help my midlife crisis. I've been, incidentally, my first visit to England was in 2003, exactly 20 years ago. I was here in Russell Square in St. Giles College, improving my English, being trained as an interpreter in Kiev. And 20 years later, I'm writing about political economy of Ukraine because important political processes started to happen. When I was studying international relations in 2004, Orange Revolution happened. It was a phenomenal time, and I was at Sussex University, and I decided to continue researching this. And as somebody who wanted to study Ukraine in the global context of this, of how political economy worked, the European aspirations were on the cards now. People rose up and they wanted life to be different. I found myself as a researcher in this kind of weird crossroads where if you wanted to study Ukraine, you either had to sit in the corner of Russian studies or area studies. And if you wanted to do global studies in political economy, nobody was interested about Ukraine and nobody could really instruct you. So my viva was taken in by a Sovietologist and a Russian scholar, because no one could really do political economy of Ukraine. I'm now leading a special issue with Stuart Shields from Manchester, who's a specialist in Poland, Gramscianism in Poland, called Terra Obscura, and it's political economy of post-Soviet space, because we're trying to bring the kind of regional expertise and wider scholarship together, because there is so much richness that can be learned from what happened in Ukraine, from what happened in Poland, Kazakhstan, and other places, but specifically now Ukraine. I was made feel when I was studying Ukraine as if I'm doing something that is very insignificant. And I'm so glad to see, 20 years later, how far, through a lot of pain, this has come. And to see this project materialize is really phenomenal. And I'm so happy to see that this fantastic, Professor Snyder, what's in your notes already, and I see some work of some of the scholars who are on the project. I'm so excited to see what will already, which directions it can take. And I think also, partly in response to some of the questions that were raised by the press here, it is so phenomenal that this project has been undertaken specifically at this historic, painful juncture in Ukrainian history. It gets thrown into Ukrainian faces. I do a lot of activist political talks that Ukrainians are censoring a political discourse. They are trying to, that there is this kind of censoring of narratives of what Ukrainian nation is and what history should be. And this is such a great slap in the face of all of those critics who say, no, we are willing to work collectively, internationally, together to learn from history, to do a proper job of it, to fill in those gaps of what was stolen in the shape of artifacts, people, scholarship, property, and also show to the whole world that through the history of Ukraine they can understand themselves better, that we can understand better what dysfunctionalities exist in the international security system, in the UN system, how some sovereignties are somehow more dispensable than others, as we have learned the hard way in Ukraine. All sorts of phenomenal things, and I cannot wait to see which directions this project will take. It's fascinating. And how Ukrainian nation has really consolidated itself in its civic nature that I've been trying to prove to people since the last Maidan, that no, Ukraine and the first invasion, that no, Ukraine is not some rabid fascist state. It never was and it never will be. And it's fascinating to see. I think nations as people learn who they are in relations with others. They show who they are in the way that they relate to others. And what Ukrainians have shown they are as a nation, and what we are showing as part of this project, and what Ukrainian politicians are showing as on the international scene, is that it's a maturing, full of energy, civic nation that really wants to have a rule of law, that wants to build a better future for themselves and for their children, and to also have historic justice, what values are promised in international system, but sometimes are not quite there. So I'm going to stop at it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Yurchenko. And I should say that as someone who's now in charge of a college in Cambridge with 120 fellows, many of which are life fellows, anybody under the age of 60 is considered young in King's College. So.
Yes!
Exactly. So it's all relative. I'm dealing with age-based caucuses in King's, and so it's all part of the challenge. So exactly. So I'd love to ask Professor Mattingly about your thoughts about where you see this going in terms of the project and what you think the priorities should be.
I will echo my colleague Yulia in many ways. It is a privilege and honor to be here today with esteemed scholars whose works I put on the reading list for my students now. And I also came to the British Museum 20 years ago, and I couldn't locate Ukraine in any of the exhibitions here. So 20 years ago, I couldn't. And 10 years ago, when I started my dissertation on the Holodomor at the University of Cambridge, I had to explain to some of my colleagues and students what the Holodomor was, because there is no book, The Short History of the Holodomor, or Introduction into the Holodomor in the Oxford or the other place series books. And there is no horrible histories on BBC about Ukraine, or there is no Who Was show about Ukraine to put it on the mental map in the West. And I would expect this project to be vital in putting Ukraine on the mental map in terms of history, to explain who are Ukrainians, where they came from, and what they are, and what do they want. And I think 10 years ago there was little interest in the Holodomor topic, and now, for the last couple of years, for all the wrong reasons or the right reasons, I've finally found it in demand. And I found also the very small number of sources I could use for the English-speaking audience to make it relevant for them. And I think what I hope this initiative to be is to, through workshops, through texts, which in the description of these initiatives, to explain to my students at Chichester and those I supervise at Cambridge, to make it obvious for them what Ukraine is, and that Ukraine is not Russia indeed, to paraphrase. And I am in a great company to do that, with people who share my approaches, and interdisciplinarity is there. So I have high hopes, and so I'm very happy for my students and for a wider audience, because we will make Ukraine happen for them.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. Well, Olga Gnityuk, I'd like to ask you, I mean, within the Cambridge ecosystem, you would definitely be considered to be young, because you're a postdoctoral researcher. You are part of the future of Ukrainian studies. But you're also in the gender department. So I'd like to tackle the elephant in the room and ask you, history has tended in all countries, including the UK, to be dominated by men, because men tend to be in charge. Men tend to, historically, have risen to the top of universities, and many of the esteemed historians in all countries at the top of the fields have been men. That is now changing everywhere across Europe and America. And when you start to have a more female perspective on history, it starts to look a bit different. So I'm curious, to what degree do you hope to bring that lens into this discussion and get a more three-dimensional, richer perspective on history going forward?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to start, as my colleagues, with saying that it is my pleasure and honor to be a part of this project. It's a great and timely project. And the project that is finally bringing not only Ukrainian history visible, but also allowing to revise, or if you would like to say revise, or rediscover European and global history with inclusion of the Ukrainian history. So it's a double approach. I think it's very valuable for this project. And as you mentioned, the lens of the gender division in history and also other studies and other departments, other science that would be involved in the project, scientists that would be involved in the project are very important and could be reflected, and it would be really advantageous for the project to reflect, not only in the part that refers to history, but also other disciplines. Does it change the project? Well, the view on the history, to some extent, perhaps it's different topics, not in several years or so, decades ago, it would be different topics for women to choose to study in history. Now it's changing and changing in a positive manner. And but the other also problem is also connected with this history itself. As for the younger generation, so female or male doesn't matter, because even 5 years ago, when I was discussing the future of my career, the future topics, I was said, if you will focus on the history of Ukraine, that would be suicide for your career. Now it's changed completely, and I'm very happy for that. And I really believe that the project like this will change it even further and will make it the Ukrainian history not marginal. We talked about the bringing Ukraine from the margins of the Russian Empire or other empires to the central, but also researchers who are doing history or other sciences to the center of discussion as well.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm curious, and this can be a question for any of you, but particularly because you've had less chance to speak so far. Professor Snyder spoke earlier about using new technology to do things like carbon dating in a way that was impossible to imagine just a few years ago. But of course, new technologies also means that we can actually engage modern Ukrainian society in a way that was impossible a few years ago. I mean, all of you've got Dia on your phone, you can see what you can do with technology and the communication opportunities it offers. Do you hope that out of this research at this time of great change, there may be a chance to maybe engage Ukrainian society and the next generation in newly dynamic ways? I mean, Professor Snyder, are you going to start doing TikToks? Or any of you? Are you? I mean, because you're all dealing with students every day. I mean, have you got any thoughts about how you can actually get out the message other than just doing a very weighty, serious BBC documentary or series and a big, hefty book?
TikTok should be banned in classrooms. That's my verdict. At the end of this term, I'm fighting it very hard. But the technologies really open up phenomenal opportunities for archaeologists, for archivists, for historians. There are possibilities of digitizing archives. There are virtual games developed where you can explore archaeological sites without leaving the room. And actually, there are ways of teaching about different spaces in a playful way. And the TikTok generation will want that. So that's good. But with the history of Ukraine is also history of Ukrainians. All of those multi-ethnic groups who, for various reasons, have either willfully left, most frequently were expelled by various means, including economic dire situation from their land, and connecting them, like writing Ukrainian stories through their history, through their stories, is extremely important. And in collecting history especially when history for many generations have been forbidden from being written, especially in a certain way, is something that technology really enables. And I think there is a massive potential in this, including tapping into collecting records of artifacts that have been taken with people where they fled, tapping into family archives, photographs, crockery, embroidery, you name it. There's been already different museums around the world that are doing excellent work, and including Ukrainian museums, on digitizing various artifacts. And also aerial technology, for example, is being used to explore and allow us to see where some sites might be, so you do not necessarily have to dig through massive fields in order to see where they are. The horrendous ecocidal catastrophe that Russia gifted us, quote unquote, associated with blowing up Kakhovka Dam, also explored in its horrible unintended consequences a wealth of artifacts that are being collected and studied now that have been at the bottom of that. So I think there is plenty of the old and the new that can meet and deliver us excellent results and enrich our projects.
Right. Do either of you want to comment? Yes.
Yeah, sure. About getting the message across, I would say social media is a powerful way to get the message across. And as Professor Snyder's podcast videos on YouTube are used by my students as well, so they are highly popular and were widely discussed in Ukraine as well. So I would say videos, and which should be free access. That's the way forward, especially for those who are dyslexic, for example, and different formats of that information on social media.
Right.
Yeah. The social media is important, but also other internet technologies that allow to show, not only tell the students or show the picture, but in a more interactive way where they can do something. Well, different platforms now allow that, and during the times of the COVID, students had to use them, and they learned, and they're very fast to learn how to, and it's became more interesting for them as well. But it also allows to popularize and to show to a wider public, not only students, the artifacts. If we talk about the past, the prehistory or archaeological history of Ukraine, but also the archival documents that are physically in Ukraine, but they could be shown, they could be interacted, read, translated, and that's all a huge advantage of the new technologies.
Yes, I mean, if nothing else, Ukraine has shown the world what you can do with a powerful app in all kinds of once unimaginable ways. I see, Professor Snyder, you were nodding enthusiastically at that point. Are you planning to do any more YouTubes, TikToks?
So on this point, agreeing with all of this, we are trying to put the horse before the cart. That is to say, we're announcing this incredibly 19th century initiative, right, with this sort of Humboldtian ambition of bringing together many scholars in many fields over many years, because we believe that it's the discovery and the research which comes first, and then the clever modes of transmission, right? We want to be discovering and making new arguments, and then we will transmit them very cleverly and taking all of this on board. Can I say something about the feminism question? So today we are launching in many different ways. We are launching metaphysically. We are launching legally. Today is the day in which we got all the paperwork in to become a charitable foundation. And we are also launching simultaneously in terms of our personnel. So the people you see up here have agreed to take part. We're in the process of inviting many, many other people. You may have some material here which doesn't have the names of the colleagues on it. If you had the names, that would give you an interesting perspective on the gender question. Also the topics. We've tried to take this on board. And there are wonderful people who are doing gender history. Even in the earliest periods, there's someone called Natalia Zions, who's published tremendous work on the women of Rus, which has been picked up by another scholar of the early medieval period called Christian Raffensperger. But if you come into it from the feminist angle, you also end up touching a whole bunch of other subjects, some of which have been raised here. So there's a woman who everyone here is going to know, but the name is going to sound like nothing to most of you. But there's a woman called Milena Rudnicka, who is going to appear in this project in a number of different ways. She's going to appear in the Holodomor chapter, maybe, because she is one of the people who tried without general success to get international attention paid to the famine in Ukraine while it was happening. She's going to appear in the statelessness chapter because she was a very powerful orator at the League of Nations who tried to draw attention to the plight of the Ukrainian minority in interwar Poland, right? She's also likely to appear in a chapter about political families because she was a member of a family of 4, each of whom played some very important role in Ukrainian nation building the first half of the 20th century. But if that weren't enough, we're also talking about someone who's, let's put it this way, spoke really good Polish. I mean, like fantastically, admirably good Polish, and went to the best Polish-speaking gymnasium in Lviv at the time. But also someone whose mother's name was Ida Spiegel, right? So someone whose career captures this political character of Ukrainian historiography that Slavko Hrysak was talking about, not least because among her many other accomplishments, she was the mother of Ivan Rudnitsky, who is the person, more than anyone else in my opinion, who won the argument about whether it's a political or whether it's a civic history, right? So when you I'm just trying to make the point that when you bring in this question, you end up touching on a whole lot of other very fundamental things which we have represented in the project.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's history in many, many dimensions. We haven't got much time left, but I know that Charlotte wants to ask another question. So, and if anyone, and we have a question at the back as well. So, do we have any microphones? If not, you may have to shout.
That's okay.
Okay? We got a mic? I'm sure you're quite used.
I want to ask a very nuts and bolts question about which is sort of slightly hard to answer, right? I wanted to know how you found your scholars. Are they applying? But it sounds like you've invited them. What is actually being funded? Is it buyouts or, how much money are you generally funding this with?
Charlotte, you have a microphone behind you, and then we're going to pass.
I don't have to do it all again, do I?
No, you just say. So how are you choosing the scholars? Who gets to be in part?
And what is the money being spent on, and how much money is being spent, so to speak?
Right. And while you're thinking of that, I can see a question right at the back. So I want to give people a chance to ask questions. We really haven't got much time left, but I do want to bring in people who want to ask questions right at the very back. And if you're standing up and waving furiously, I think you deserve a question.
Hello. My name is Oliver Bullough. I'm a journalist, an author. I'm just interested. It's difficult to, possibly impossible, to write the history of modern Ukraine without describing the role of large business people, and difficult to describe the role of large business people without describing the role of Mr. Pinchuk. I'm interested how, in that case, you would evade any perception of a conflict of interest, considering the source of the funding.
Right. The question is, insofar as Ukraine, the modern history is also about large business people, how do you tackle the question of the funding for the project from Mr. Pinchuk, and whether one is going to look at that as part of history of Ukraine?
So I was designated to take the fun questions. So do you want to say something, Victor, or do you want? Okay. So I mean so as Victor signaled, we spent a lot of time talking about this, and so I will now slightly tell his story from my point of view. Victor had an excellent idea, which was the deep history of Ukraine. And we talked through for a long time how you would actually do the deep history of Ukraine. And this discussion had a number of angles. One of them was conceptual. One of them was institutional. So from my point of view, I spent a lot of time trying to take, Victor's inspiration and turn it into something which could actually happen. And a third dimension of that discussion is the question that you raise, which I'm happy to answer, which is how do you then take an idea and the funding and turn it into an institution which not only works, but which is, so to speak, morally bulletproof. And the way that we have done this is by going to, and I say this with love and respect for the legal traditions of this country, I didn't even mean that ironically. I really, no. Thank you for that. But we spent an enormous amount of time going through the process of establishing a UK-based institution, a charitable foundation, so that everything will be highly regulated, highly transparent, and everyone has a look in to what's actually going on, right? So there's no way to avoid the question because it's a good question. What we can do is have an institutional answer, because no personal answer is going to be good, right? You can never say, oh, well, actually, he's a nice guy. You know, that's not the answer. I mean, he may or may not be, right? The answer is, what's the institution, right? And we have an institution. So, and the second part of the answer is, we are going to do contemporary Ukrainian political economy. There is one of the capsules, or what I'm calling the subjects, is about oligarchy. We are not going to dodge the wonderful period of the 1990s. So we wouldn't want to get around it, and we're not going to get around it. On Charlotte's question, I mean, on how much money this is, I'm going to pass on that. I'm just going to say that there are I can think of few endeavors in the contemporary humanities, at least, which are on this scale. Keeping just under 100 scholars active for around 3 years. If you just do the math, it's a fair amount of money. And we are giving people enough money so that at least people in the beginning of their careers could reasonably buy out teaching, or later on support a postdoc, or support a lab. And we'll be supplementing that with other money for people who want to do projects inside Ukraine. So I don't want to toss the numbers around in front of the cameras, but it's a meaningful amount of support which will keep people going if they need to be kept going, and will allow them to buy off courses or have postdocs or whatever it is. And that's an important thing. We're not going to dictate to people whether it's for a postdoc or buying off teaching, or whether it's for a lab or whatever. We are now in the stage, Ruslan and the team are now at the stage where we're asking people what would be useful to you, and then we're going to negotiate how we can best support people. So it's not 90 people, we're all doing the same thing. It is, we're going to talk with everyone and figure out what's best for them so that we can build this larger team. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, here I will confess that we had
putting an advert in The Guardian and getting 10,000 applications.
Yeah. No, so it's not, it started with the themes. So I think there is some written representation of the themes out there, but it started with the themes. Got it? Okay. So the themes came first. It kind of goes to this question of what artifacts would you want to have? It was, what themes in an ideal world would you want to have in Ukrainian history? And so I went through that exercise with consulting colleagues, but that part of it was mainly me. The exercise of what themes you would want to have to make the whole thing work. And I came up with roughly 70 of them. And then from there, I went from there to who has been doing the work on these themes, and then checking that with colleagues who have been close to the project from the beginning, and then the invitations went out on that basis. So we are necessarily going to be missing a lot of great people because they don't line up with the themes, or because it's redundant, or whatever it might be. But I mean, we're happily going to be bringing in a very large number of people, including, and this is something that we keep coming back to, but it's important to me that we're bringing in mostly Ukrainians, and it's important to me that we're doing a lot of work in the earlier and not just the modern periods, thereby keeping open fields of scholarship which often get overlooked.
Right.
Department of Fun questions number 3. Absolutely. I mean, going back to my answer to Oliver's question, this is. You can imagine that this is a point where I was rather active because partly, I mean, for a number of reasons, right? One of them is that just very practically, there's no way that I'm going to be recruiting people for something like this unless I can say, you will have full academic freedom. And not only do people have full academic freedom, they can publish what they do funded by this project. We're not going to claim it. I mean, often like there are contracts where like I'm being offered these contracts all the time. We claim everything that you have written on this. It's not like that at all. We're supporting people to do their own work. They just have to, in the end, produce this bit of writing, which we're then going to use. So no, there's academic independence is written into the charter of the corporation, the charter of the charitable foundation. It's written into the offer letters to the people. It's written into the email that I sent out to everyone. It's absolutely central to this for reasons of principle, of course, as well as practice.
We have one question there, and then I think we should give Victor the last word. Yes.
Well, thank you. Alec Russell here from the Financial Times, probably with Gillian. So you and I were talking this morning, as it happens, and you were saying, we were talking about traveling in and talking to people in Ukraine, and you were saying how important it was to speak to enough people because understandably, given all that's happening there, some people have lost some perspective because of all the the war, etc. And I was thinking of this in terms of writing history now. You're all writing history at a time of acute stress in Ukraine, the most terrible stress really imaginable. And I just wondered, how do you check yourselves when you're writing this history that you, professional, serious historians as you are, haven't actually allowed current events to affect what you're writing?
And I think that very important existential question will have to be the last question because we are almost out of time. I'm sure everyone's ready for a drink in a moment. But Sergei, do you want to address that?
Sure.
How do you
it's important question, and the question that I struggled with writing my book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. It was published earlier this year. So the issue was not just to what degree the events that are happening today are influencing my interpretation of the 16th or 17th century. I was with Luke Harding, I once mentioned to him that the journalists were encroaching on our territory and we were encroaching on the territory of journalists. So that's a really nightmare methodologically and otherwise for a historian. So it's even more complex and dangerous, the whole undertaking is not just writing at the time of the stress, but also writing about that stress itself. And the general idea is that you try to stay basically as close to the standards of your profession as you can. I personally, at the beginning of the book, I say who I am. I say how I learned about the war, how I was affected, and my family was affected. But that's where I try to actually turn the page on that part of the story, and to be as good a historian as I can. I can tell you that what is happening today in Ukraine certainly changed my perspective of a number of things, not just of contemporary developments, but on the history that I was writing before. Because what I realized was that in my history that I was writing before was absent to a great degree the issues related to emotions and to experience of going through the trauma, going through the tragedy. I suddenly realized that people that I was writing about, including the earlier generation of historians, that they were going through the exile, they were going through the bombing of their houses, losing their loved ones. We mentioned Hrushevsky today. 1918, the Russian Red Army on purpose bombed his house. It was burned. He lost his mother in that fire. And that aspect, emotional aspect, and what that does to the people, I was not really getting it. I don't think I was particularly writing bad history, but that was aspect that I didn't feel. I don't know yet how to translate that in the history that I am writing now and today, but the time of stress, they not only present these challenges, and I don't know how to deal with half of those challenges. We are still trying to figure out, it's uncharted waters. But they also provide perspective and understanding of history that at least I lacked before that.
Well, thank you. I'm very conscious we are actually technically out of time, but I'd like to ask, Victor, do you want to say anything in response to the questions, or?
In general, Professor Snyder gave, I think, full answer to that questions about funding and my involvement in this project on the next stages. Probably I will set up. But I just want to confirm it. For me, it's very important. From the very beginning, it was absolute priority for me and for Professor Snyder that it has to be absolutely, perfectly independent project. Independent for scientists who will be involved, and independent not only from money, but also, by the way, from politicians. You will see board, no politicians involved in this project, and I will have one vote. I am just a normal member of the board of trustees. I had zero influence on the who is a member, who are the member of academic board. I had only one suggestion. Unfortunately, it was impossible to implement. I said, okay, because emotionally for me, Jared Diamond he was so inspirational. Let's try to invite him. And Professor Snyder communicated with him, but Professor Diamond, he's busy. He's not young enough already to be involved in this project. But it was only my, let's say, suggestion. I have zero influence who will be involved, who will be the scientists, and this is absolutely important for me because I understand that we cannot compromise this project, reputation of this project, and just zero influence. That's all. It's not only my moral commitment, but of course this is, we spent a lot of time when we created this legal structure, this institution. It will be regulated very strongly by the special regulator, Charitable Commission of England and Wales, just very strong. Okay, this is what I can add if I gave you some additional information. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you. I'll just say one last thing in closing, which is that early on, after the invasion, I was writing quite a lot about the military technology, and there was a presumption amongst many of the Western militaries that they were going to help Ukraine, teach Ukraine how to fight. Of course, what's happened is that Ukraine has ended up teaching the West as much as anything else by demonstration, not just about resilience, not just about a determination to uphold Soviet values, but also a new way of innovating and using technology in very creative ways. And the teaching journey is now going in two directions. I suspect that what's happening now with this historical project may end up having a demonstration effect that goes well beyond just the sphere of this project, and as you said, Professor Snyder, could end up provoking many people to rethink how they look at history in a wider sense, particularly if they are emerging from a period of imperialism or being victims of imperialism. So, it's going to be a question of history being truly a verb, not a noun. And I'll just end up by saying, good luck. So thank you.